Just a couple of things to say before I introduce Sam. Some of you have apparently been confused by the schedule today, which says dinner with Joe with selected faculty. You all, actually, it's a student dinner. It's really all for everybody. It's just that some selected faculty and Joe are going to be speaking at the dinner. So please make sure that you come to dinner at, I don't know, it's 8 o'clock.
And it's in that same
It's in the place where we started the workshop. Okay, and if that's not enough incentive, there's also going to be wine in here. So, so please make sure that that happens. Now, today's talk. It's a privilege to introduce, but it's also somewhat, I guess, difficult for me because it's emotional a lot, and there's a lot to be said. About 15 years ago, I went through a period which all of you have, obviously, at one point or the other, which is to decide whether to go to graduate school or not. And I was asking various people. Venu, who's actually helped set up this workshop, put me in touch with another faculty member who had gone to graduate school in the US. And he said, and he listened to my interests, right? And he smiled indulgently at me at the end of it and said, you should go work with Sam Bowles. And that's a statement about me. I didn't realize at that point, and about my interests and about my persuasions. So I did go to graduate school, and although I didn't work with Sam as a student, I really am his student in many ways. And many of us who have been, who are here have this very strong bond, and many years down the line we find ourselves relearning something that we learned in Sam's class. And it happens to me now 10 years after I left graduate school. So there's too much to be said, so I won't say much more. And I'll just introduce Sam Bowles, who is at the Santa Fe Institute and the University of Siena, and also teaches the same course that he's taught for many years, the one that influenced all of us at UMass Amherst. So, Sam.
Thanks, Arjun. Well, thanks to Arjun and thanks to the organizers. It's great to be here. Thank you, Joe, for the idea of having this, and to the foundation and the university. I want to talk about wealth inequality from the standpoint of how would a social planner who had a redistributional agenda try to understand wealth inequality and the way in which one might actually exploit the possibilities of redistribution so as to enhance the efficiency of the economy. Now, of course, that may sound strange because here we have Arthur Oaken saying the conflict between equality and economic efficiency is inescapable. And that's probably the best source for something that appears in almost every textbook, the equality-efficiency trade-off. What I want to say is that what's happened since Oaken wrote that is that economics has changed a lot. A lot of it actually due to the stuff that Joe has written in microeconomic theory. There are a lot of reasons, theoretical reasons, not just empirical ones, for doubting the inescapability of the trade-off to which Oaken refers. There are two primary things that have happened in economics that I think are the most important. And one is that it's now taken as being the norm that contracts are incomplete. That's true in credit markets, labor markets, markets for information, and so on. And in light of these incomplete contracts, there often are ways that one can redistribute wealth so as to enhance the efficiency of the economy, meaning the aggregate social welfare by any measure. Even, this may surprise you to know, you can redistribute wealth so as to achieve a Pareto improvement. That may sound like an oxymoron, but I'll show you that it's true. Redistribution can be Pareto improving. Now, the other thing that's happened in economics is that it's now taken as for granted that the population of economic agents is heterogeneous. We have some self-interested people, some altruistic ones, some with inequality aversion, and so on. People are motivated by a combination of ethical and self-interested motives. One of the things we get from this literature is that people really dislike injustice. And for that reason, it becomes quite expensive to sustain highly unequal societies. Arjun and I have worked quite a bit on trying to document the kinds of expenditures that societies engage in to sustain highly unequal distributions of wealth and income. We found rather shocking fractions of the U.S. labor force devoted to such things as security personnel and keeping people in prison and so on. Now, I want to ask a question, and this is not an easy question. It's a slightly complex question. Suppose you're a social planner and you're observing a private economy and you have the capacity to intervene. I think the question to which you would need an answer is that if you're an egalitarian and you're thinking of redistributing wealth, does there exist a redistribution of wealth? That means redistributing residual claimancy and control rights over some assets. Does there exist such a redistribution that has two characteristics? It would not have already been accomplished by private exchange. And secondly, if it is implemented, it won't be undone by private exchange. I think you understand the problem here. According to the Coase theorem, if there is something which is going to be beneficial in the Pareto sense, it should be, of course, implemented by Coasean bargaining, as long as there are no barriers to efficient bargaining. We have plenty of examples of cases of redistribution that have implemented egalitarian, say, land ownership, only to find that the poor farmers who have acquired the ownership rights have sold their land so as to acquire a truck or a house, something less risk exposed. So we're really asking here, are we in a world in which there are two possible equilibria? One is the current situation, and the other is one in which the social planner does the job of equilibrium selection. And he or she then implements a new distribution of wealth in which a different allocation is then an equilibrium. And the second one is one which is preferred on egalitarian grounds. Of course, I add in, it can also even be Pareto efficient, so it would be universally preferred. That's kind of frosting on the cake, because as an egalitarian, one doesn't mind redistributing from the well-off to the less well-off on purely ethical grounds. But on political grounds, it has a nice feature that one can actually design programs that are not highly costly, even to those who have their assets redistributed away. And this is the social planner. You'll see him in future slides. It's not an easy job, but you're all engaged in this kind of thing because everyone in this room is interested in public policy. And you have to think in general equilibrium terms, and that's what the general equilibrium model looks like if you're trying to be a social planner. Now, I want to give you the overview of what the big idea is here. In 2 slides, we're going to actually get into a very particular model which will illustrate some of the mechanisms. But I want to start with the notion that we can view egalitarian asset redistribution as a development strategy. And the idea here is that the ways in which we govern the economy is limited by the wealth distribution. And sometimes greater equality in the wealth distribution allows us superior governance structures. So here we have the distribution of wealth and the governance structures. These, of course, influence each other. And both together then introduce these desired outcomes, productivity and distribution of economic opportunity. So this is the basic causal structure that I'm looking at. And what I'm saying is you, the social planner, are going to enter here and you're going to redistribute wealth that may allow a different kind of governance structure, and that then may have effects on this which are positive. Now, there are plenty of examples of this. I'll deal with just one in the following lecture. But, you know, employee ownership of firms, allowing less wealthy people to borrow for productive investments of any kind, high-quality education for all is another kind of asset-based redistribution, abolishing or substantially limiting intellectual property rights, and so on. The list can go on and on. All of these are arguably egalitarian redistributions of wealth, which can be productivity enhancing. There's a large literature on this, to which I have contributed marginally, but I give you the stuff which I have written here because I'll be talking with some of you this afternoon, and I obviously I won't refer you to things that I know less well than my own work. But there is a very nice paper by Carla. She's probably forgotten it, but that was when Carla and I were part of a research group on, or just I guess the year before, a research group on exactly this kind of problem. This is the paper with Arjun on what we call guard labor, the kind of labor which essentially is not producing stuff, it's just essentially advancing the claims of one party or another to benefit from the production process. Now, as I said, we'll go quickly to a model, and you'll see why it is that in this particular case, it'll be a credit market. In this particular case, why do I think that it's possible not only to redistribute so as to have a higher level of social welfare, but even to redistribute in a Pareto superior manner. We have a project, I'll call it a machine, it costs $1. It'll fail with a probability that's increasing in the speed at which the machine is run. The machine has a dial on it, and the dial goes from 0 to 1. And the only person who can see the dial or how it's set is the operator of the machine. For simplicity and to eliminate a redundant variable, f is the speed of the machine, and it's also, I've defined it over 0, 1, it's the probability that the machine fails. So f you'll see doing double duty, it's how fast the machine's running, it's also the probability of failure. Now, the idea is this: the machine is running and the goods are available at the end of the period. If the machine has not failed, you get the goods, and then that's one state of the world. If the machine has failed, it explodes and it destroys all the goods that have been produced thus far, and so there are no goods available. The expected returns that of all non-interest costs are some function, this is the returns, this is the speed of the machine, that's how good the machine is, mu is a productivity parameter, and 1 minus f is the probability that the machine did not explode. So conditional on the machine surviving this experience of being run at the speed f, it'll produce this amount of goods. And obviously this gives us a return schedule that looks like this. This is the speed of the machine, this is the returns, and there is some maximum of that process. Now, I often use Robinson Crusoe as a way of looking at a world with, by definition, no market failures. Oh, that's what the machine looks like if it's run too fast. So here's the Robinson Crusoe case. We have a single risk-neutral operator of the project, and it's called Robinson Crusoe RC, but that also stands for residual claimant. Isn't that convenient? This individual varies f to maximize this function here, and I'm probably just looking at that, you can tell what the maximum is going to have to be. We set the derivative equal to 0, and of course the machine is run at speed 1/2. Let's look at a case. So this, by the way, the reason why I do this, and I do this in almost every problem I try to solve, is I start with Robinson Crusoe to try to get a kind of a benchmark. And you sometimes come back to it, it's sometimes useful. Now, let's take a case in which everything in this problem is fully contractible, so that if I borrow some money, the person from whom I borrowed the money can specify in a contract the speed of the machine. So this is a hypothetical case. Remember, this is not reality, but I'm saying suppose it were true. Then we would have the following. The agent, me, borrows funds, $1 from the lender, the principal, and I agree to repay delta at the end of the period. Delta is therefore the interest factor, not the interest rate. It's 1 plus the interest rate. And I also agree to operate the machine at the speed f, which is written into the contract and is, by hypothesis, enforceable. I'll obviously repay delta at the end of the period with probability 1 minus f, that is, the machine hasn't blown up with that probability, and I repay. And I pay 0 otherwise. And the reason for that is I repay nothing if I'm bankrupt because I'm in a society in which there's limited liability. Now, my per period expected return on the agent, I borrowed the thing, will be the following. My return, my expected return, depends on the interest factor and the speed at which the machine is run, like that. And that's equal to, these are the returns that come from the project, just as in the Robinson Crusoe case. And that's my expected repayment, namely the interest factor times the probability that the machine did not blow up. And we can rewrite that, obviously, as the far right equation. And I think you can see where this is going, because the agent's next best alternative will say is to receive 0. So that's his participation constraint is that you have to, his expected income has to be at least 0. We'll assume it's satisfied as an equality. I do this just, I don't particularly like Lagrangian expressions. As a teacher, I find you can almost always get rid of them just by using some economic analysis on the constraint itself. If you know the PC is going to be satisfied as inequality, don't bother with the Lagrangian, just express it as inequality and do the relevant substitution. So we're going to set this term equal to 0, that's this, and then we get this equation here. That's the participation constraint for the agent, and I call it the supply price of F. That is, this says that, for example, if the lender imposes on me a high interest factor, I'll run the machine faster. And obviously, he doesn't want me to do that. Obviously, if the machine is a really good machine, I'll run it slower because I stand to lose by the machine blowing up. Now, let's continue with this hypothetical case. The principal is going to vary F. Remember, he now has the capacity to contractually require me to operate it at a certain speed, and will maximize expected profits, which is just the expected repayment. And as I say, treating the PC as an equality and substituting in the value, we get the following equation. So the principal's profits are now F times mu times 1 minus F. Does that look familiar? That was Robinson Crusoe's objective function. So obviously, he's going to maximize this in the same way that RC did, and he'll set F star at equal to 1/2. Now, this may seem a very simple exercise, but it actually is a very deep point. Because in this case, we have this interaction between these two individuals, but we recover the Robinson Crusoe case. We've essentially taken a social relationship between two individuals, the lender and the borrower, and converted that to an interaction as if it was the interaction between an individual and nature. Now, how is that? What's the secret here? I'm saying, by the way, that is a move whereby in neoclassical economics, interactions between people are converted to interactions between an active agent and an inert given nature. Now, typically in economics, the nature is a price vector. But it wouldn't matter if it was Robinson Crusoe's island or a price vector. It's the same problem. It's non-strategic. It's just somebody interacting with a given environment. This is neoclassical economics as depicted. Carla nods. Carla was an undergraduate major in French literature. Is that right, Carla? So Carla knows that this is a Millet painting. Now, of course, some people say they're a bunch of peasant women. I say what this is these are three individuals who are interacting with nature. That's all they're doing. This is just a kind of Robinson Crusoe type picture. Now, what's interesting here is this. The answer to how do you take a social interaction and turn it into an interaction like the ladies are doing, they're just interacting with nature. The answer, just 2 words, complete contracts. That's what complete contracts gives you. It's a way of converting strategic interactions into a one-person-like interaction. Now, this is still the hypothetical case. We have here the participation constraint. Here we have the speed of the machine. Here we have the interest factor. This is an iso-profit locus, and obviously this first order condition is just given here, and you can see what it says is that the slope of the indifference curve, that's the marginal rate of substitution between speed and the interest factor, has to be equal to the marginal rate of transformation of the interest factor into speed. So that's a fairly obvious first order condition. And by the way, you know instantly, if you look at this problem, the result is Pareto efficient. How do you know that? Because the principal is maximizing with the participation constraint as the constraint. That defines a Pareto optimum. That's how we say a Pareto optimum. You want to discover a Pareto optimum, you say, arbitrarily pick some level of utility of one agent and then maximize the other person's utility with respect to that constraint. Well, that's what this is. And so not only does the complete contracts convert a social interaction into a Robinson Crusoe type picture, like Robinson Crusoe, it assures you that the result will be, in this case, Pareto efficient. Now, of course, it's Pareto efficient, but highly redistributively unbalanced because, of course, the lender gets the entire surplus. Now, let's look at the case. Now let's get back to the real world. We now have F is non-contractible. There's no collateral, so the agent has he's not going to put anything into the project. Would you prefer that I had this thing on?
Yeah.
I'll say that for the principal is a she. And so she chooses delta, that is the interest factor, to maximize expected returns, given the agent's best response function, which we'll derive in just a minute. Now, the agent is going to choose F. So that's basically the principal's choosing delta, the agent's producing, going to choose F, to maximize his expected income. His expected income is, as before, what the machine produces minus the expected repayment, giving us this first order condition, just by differentiating that expression and setting the result equal to 0. That, I'm not going to ask you to explain that, even though this is supposed to be a school. And this gives us the best response function. This says, for any delta selected by the principal, the agent will choose to operate the machine at this speed. Now notice, this is the 1/2 that Robinson Crusoe would have used. So if the interest factor were 0 for some reason, you would reproduce the Robinson Crusoe case. Obviously, it would never be optimal for the lender to lend at that. But what this says is that the higher is the interest factor, the faster the machine will be run. And the better is the machine, the slower the machine will be run. So that's just the best response function of the borrower. And here we have the new problem. Remember, this was the participation constraint. That's now irrelevant. What's relevant is the best response function. So the principal can choose any point on this line, but cannot choose any other. That is, the constraint is this behavioral relationship given by the agent's BRF. Now let's see how you create the BRF, because that's going to be crucial in showing something about Pareto efficiency. Suppose the principal has chosen some delta, and then the agent is considering how fast should I run the machine. So the agent is essentially moving up and down this line to find the maximum. Well, the agent has these ISO expected income loci. There's another one here, another one there, some preferred ones over here. The preferred ones are over here, obviously. The dispreferred ones are here. And so as he moves up here, he finds a tangency there. Now, what's crucial here is that's a tangency to a vertical line. So at every point along this best response function, the expected income indifference locus of the borrower is vertical. That will be important later. And let me see if I have anything else I want to... why is it vertical? Well, I'll just explain why it's vertical. Let me pause. Am I going too fast? Somebody asked me a question. You'll do everyone else a favor. About the setup. Why did I set it up this way? Why is it such a simple model? It's anything.
Explain this last bit again about the
Wait a minute, you can't ask questions. You already took the class. No, about why it's vertical?
Why it's vertical, and also, yes, I mean, how you get the best response function line.
Well, there are a number of ways you can get the best response function. Obviously, the best response function is gotten by differentiating this y with respect to f and setting that result equal to 0. The slope of this indifference curve here is the ratio of those two derivatives. It's the marginal rate of substitution. So setting one of those to 0, it has to be vertical at the optimum. But that's a kind of mathematical way of saying it. The easy way to see it is, I should have drawn another indifference curve here. That's worse, the one I just drew. So as you move up through this space, you're getting better and better and better, and then at that point, you're at the peak, and then after that, you're going down. So basically, at this point, you've got the maximum. And that's true, I mean, to take any other point, and take any other interest factor, it'll be true everywhere. So along here, every point on this best response function is characterized by a vertical indifference curve. That'll be crucial. That's a 911 in case anybody really has some emergency about not being able to answer that, but I will seem to do no emergencies. Oh, there it is. Now, we have here the principal's ISO profit function. That's the same as it was before. And now in this case, the principal is maximizing a function given by this indifference curve and the other indifference curves. Remember, before it was tangent to the participation constraint. Now it'll be tangent to the best response function because that's the best she can do. Now obviously this shaded area is important. What that says is the principal would like to be below that indifference curve. The expected profits are higher in this area because the interest factor is higher and the speed's lower. The agent would rather be to the left over here. And obviously at that point, which is supposed to be it's all coinciding here, I didn't draw it right, there is this set of Pareto improvements. From here, if you move to a point there, it's preferable because it's below the expected profits of the lender, and it's to the left of the expected income of the borrower. So there's an entire set here of points. And that shows that in this problem, you must have a set of Pareto improvements which coincide with the Nash equilibrium of the case here. There's an interesting point here, which is we see that the agent does better than his participation constraint because the participation constraint is here and he's up there, and that's obviously better. Now that is an interesting question because in models of the labor market, typically the worker gets a job rent. And if I ask you, why does the worker get a job rent in a labor discipline model, you'll readily answer, well, the employer pays the worker a wage better than his or her next best alternative, so that the worker has something to lose if the employer catches the worker not working. That's a correct answer, but it's not a correct answer here because this is a one-shot game. There is no renewal or contingent renewal. The agent receives a rent. But the rent is not an enforcement rent, or not an enforcement rent in the contingent sense. I remember, Carla doesn't remember this, but I remember asking Carla, Carla has a beautiful model in that paper, it's a different model, but makes some of the same points. And I remember asking Carla a long time ago, Carla, why does the guy get the rent? And because I was used to the labor market models in which the rent was doing this job of threat. What you said was, that's just the best that the principal can do. And I think that's the right answer. It was a little disappointing. Because in the labor market model, it's exciting. I'm giving you the rent because I'm going to take it away, and so on. But it's just, this is the best he can do. The reason why it's the best he can do, obviously, is the best response function of the individual is uniformly higher than the participation constraint. Now, let's go on to the summary so far. We have the Robinson Crusoe case. The machine is run at 1/2, and we have a total surplus of mu/4. And Robinson gets the whole thing. That mu/4 is 1/2 times 1/2 times mu. Right? That's mu times f times 1 minus 1. Yeah.
I want that how to interpret that trend, the fact that the best response function is above the participation. Can't you say that it arises because the agent is taking a risk from which he'll get something if things go well, he won't lose if things do not, because he's sort of like giving the principal the bad part of the deal?
I don't know. I mean, I've never been able to, I mean, that may be the explanation of why that's the best the principal can do. Yeah. Is that a hand up? No? Okay. In the second case that I gave, we have contractible risk. Again, the machine is run at 1/2. The interest factor is mu/2, and the agent gets nothing and the principal gets everything. That's by definition because we push the agent back to his participation constraint. Now, in the single period here, where we have where f is non-contractible, this is the best response function. You saw that before. It's just 1/2 plus this other stuff, depending on the interest factor. The machine is now run at 3/4 speed, and you know why that's true. I hope you do, because basically, given the fact that we have limited liability, the fact every time you offer a loan contract, you're inevitably offering also an insurance contract, because if the machine blows up, you don't pay. And that gives you an incentive to run the machine faster. The interest factor is mu/2. That's model specific, by the way. That's not necessarily the case. But notice here what we have. We have a distribution of the surplus. The principal now gets mu over 8. The agent gets mu over 16. Notice two things. The principal gets more than the agent, and the two do not sum up to the total of the surplus which was available when the machine was run at 1/2. So there is a loss because of this incentive difficulty and the incompleteness of the contract. So do people understand how this, why it is that this line here, this is the real world line here, why it is? Are there questions about that? What I'm going to do next is I'm going to show that in this case, a redistribution by governmental fiat from the rich person to the poor, with a lender to the borrower, can be Pareto improving. Yes?
You've only allowed for debt contracts. I mean, can't you think of other contracts like an equity contract which might not give you the same inefficiency?
It gives identical results. I mean, I teach it this way just because I always did. But if it doesn't make any difference. And I was surprised. It must be because of the simplicity of the model. Now, let's look at the yeah, Joe.
I'm almost sure that if you have very nonlinear equity contracts, then you can force the contractible risk.
In other words, you can recover the F equals 1/2.
Yeah. So by that I mean.
Well, then Reggie would be right. Because all I did is I had a linear equity contract.
That's right. And in most of these models, with sufficient nonlinearity, so basically you really penalize him if you ever observe. So I mean, the question here is, what is observable?
Yeah.
And in this model, it is observable what the output is in the stakes of nature when you don't blow up. So ex post, when I don't blow up, I know that I ran the machine too high.
No, as long as you ran the machine at all, it can blow up. Remember?
No, I understand.
Yeah.
But when it doesn't blow up,
Yeah.
you know how much the output is.
Yeah.
I think that's the assumption.
Yeah.
And therefore, ex post, you know that he must have run. You see an F that's very large.
Yeah.
And therefore, you knew that.
Yes, that's sure. That's right.
Right. So now, if you take away all the gains that you would have gotten,
Yeah.
if he runs the machine too fast, then you discourage him from running the machine fast.
Yeah.
And you can force him to F equals 1/2.
Yeah, I'd want to explore whether or not, and again, I'm coming back to the paper that Carla did, the paper I referred to, 926, was very nice because what it shows is if there's a limited amount of punishment you can impose on the person, then it limits strongly this kind of contract.
Sure, and that's what I say. I think in this model, without punishment, but where you're being able to extract all of the F beyond a certain level, you can, in effect, force them to take F equal 1/2.
Yeah, well, I'd like to look at that. That's right.
Yes.
Now, what we're going to do now is look at what happens when we have differences in wealth among individuals. Let's look at the case where the individual, the agent, has wealth K, which is currently invested in a risk-free asset, and that yields rho K. The agent, if the agent devoted K to the project, then the expected returns on the project would be as follows. This is the output of the project. Now we have the amount of repayment. 1 minus K is the amount that the individual had to borrow. This is the likelihood of repayment, and that's the opportunity cost of spending the money on the project rather than in the risk-free asset. As before, the agent's going to select F so as to maximize the maximize the expected income, and we have a first-order condition which looks exactly like the one before. It's 1/2 plus something having to do with the interest factor and the productivity of the machine, but now it's reduced by 1 minus K. So the more the individual has put into the project, the less speedy the machine will be run. That's in the sense in which the individual giving some wealth to this project improves, from the standpoint of the lender, the best response function. Now, I'll now introduce the zero profit condition. You'll see in a couple of slides that I don't think is necessarily applicable in all cases, but suppose there is a zero profit condition, because what it means is if the expected profit is above a certain level, then funds will flood into the loanable funds market, or if it's below that, they'll exit. If you want a simple story, you can say there's a worldwide rate that with highly mobile funds, or just say the very rich people have a rather peculiar utility function with a rate of time preference such that they consume everything if the rate of return is less than rho, and they'll invest everything if it's higher than rho. Now, the zero profit condition says that the expected return has to be equal to 1 plus rho. And so this is a condition for the stationarity of funds in the market. And I show you Leon Balras because it's very much in his spirit that I impose that constraint. Now here's what the picture looks like. Here we have the interest factor, here we have the speed of the machine. And this is, these three lines are best response functions. The very steep best response function is the best response function of a guy who has no capital. This guy has capital K0, and that's his best response function. And this richer guy has a larger K, and that's his best response function. These are the, as before, the isoprofit loci. Here's one which is preferable to the lender. This is one less preferable. In fact, this is the one which is the zero profit condition. So this thing here is the zero profit condition. Now, what you can infer from that is this person here with no wealth cannot get a loan, because there's no point on his or her best response function which intersects the zero profit condition. So this person is excluded. This person here has enough wealth, so they're definitely going to get a loan, and we'll see. It's a question at what interest rate they'll get it, but they will definitely get a loan. And this person here with K0 has just enough, so that's the marginal borrower. And we can see that that person is going to pay this interest rate delta 0. And run the machine at F0. Now, as we say, the guy is excluded, but what about the rich guy? Well, I mean, when I first wrote this problem down, I did the obvious thing, which is I maximized this function here, this expected profits, with the best response function as a constraint, and I got, oh, the rich guy is going to pay D star, delta star, and that means, of course, that the rich individual will be paying a higher interest rate than the poorer individual. And that's true. That's not a mistake. I wasn't mistaken to do that, but I was ignoring the zero profit condition. The zero profit condition says that this is the equilibrium, which is it's a point on the best response function of the rich guy at which the zero profit condition is fulfilled. And that's the way that you can demonstrate that under conditions of a competitive labor market, credit market, the individual with a marginal amount of wealth pays a higher interest rate than the individual with a lot of wealth. But obviously, I'm using the zero profit condition to generate that result. And is that the institution that governs the lending? If you're in a small town, there may be one or two money lenders. This guy Harpal from Palanpur, who said that you can make a lot of money in credit markets if you wield a big stick. Now, this is the graph you just saw. And this just says that we have a bargaining problem here. That is, these are all the possible outcomes, the distribution of expected profits and expected income. Any point along this line is feasible given the bargaining structure. You could have a situation here in which the monopolist, the monopoly lender, gets the whole thing, or you could have a situation there in which these points correspond. That's that point there, and that's that point there. So I put this here just to tell you that whether or not the rich guy pays more or less and what he pays in between, it's going to depend on the rules governing that interaction. Let's think about the kind of quantity constraints that we're looking at. Summarizing what we have so far, borrowers with insufficient wealth will be excluded. And secondly, borrowers with some wealth, but not enough to finance the whole project, will be credit constrained. And what that means in this model is that the wealthier borrowers are able to have larger projects. They're able to have projects of lower quality. I haven't shown you that, but I think it's quite obvious that a high-quality project is going to give you a better best response function. So if you're richer, you can have a worse project. Secondly, and thirdly, for projects of the same size and quality as those of the less wealthy, the wealthier borrowers pay lower interest rates in competitive credit markets. So that summarizes what we've learned so far. Now, let's think about these Pareto enhancing redistributions. Remember where you heard that expression first, Pareto enhancing redistribution. It's said to be, I know people don't like the Pareto criterion, and they say, well, the problem with the Pareto criterion is you can't study redistribution using it, and that's not true. Of course you can study it as long as you essentially attribute to the social planner some kind of ability to intervene. So let's look at this problem here. Suppose I'm going to give some number to mu, just to calibrate this. Mu, remember that's the productivity of the machine, is equal to 8 times 1 plus the risk-free interest rate. The government now is going to confiscate the machine, or the assets which are used to get the machine, and give it to the what was the erstwhile lender. The erstwhile lender now becomes a residual claimant, or Robinson Crusoe. The individual operates the machine as Robinson Crusoe did. And then the state imposes a tax of 1 plus rho on the erstwhile borrower, now owner, Robinson Crusoe, which is paid in compensation to the ex-owner. So that's the social planner's idea. Let's see how that works. We're going to take this case here, which is what I call the real-world case, and see what we get. We'll take the before and the after. The joint surplus was 3 mu over 16. The owner got this much, and the operator got that much. That's just off this table here. After, the joint surplus is mu over 4, because now the machine is being run at the, quote, right speed, the Robinson Crusoe speed. So the surplus is now mu over 4, and it's divided between the two in the following way. And notice that the ex-owner of this thing is now getting what she got before, namely mu over 8, whereas the operator's income is doubled. So it's a Pareto-driven redistribution of wealth. Now,
Sam,
yeah.
Can it be shown that it would be similar if the government is taxing or making the redistribution with K or also even with income? Like if the government targets wealth rather than productivity?
I don't know. I haven't done it. But I mean, the basic idea here is you know, when I showed you that thing about distribution of wealth, governance structures, and the arrows, this is an example, because you redistribute wealth and you get a different governance structure over this asset. Namely, the person now is going to bear all the costs of the machine exploding, and so is going to operate it at the right speed. So that, I mean, that's how it works. If you can do that through some other intervention, I mean, that's the idea. Is make sure, if you have an incomplete contract, the problem is that the agent has something which is relevant to productivity on which there's a conflict of interest for which you can't write a complete contract. The solution to the problem is let that person be the residual claimant on the thing which you couldn't contract. And that's what we do here. Now, this is my view of how this process works. But why did Robin Hood succeed in this case? And the real question is, why can the government accomplish what private exchange couldn't? If this thing was there, why didn't Coase-in bargaining implement it? Why wasn't the Coase theorem enough? Because we obviously have a Pareto improvement. Anybody? What can the government do that the private actors can't do? Coerce people into paying taxes even if the machine blew up. Your tax payment is not subject to limited liability. Your payment of the loan is subject to limited liability. So it's precisely the government's capacity to impose the compensation that allows us to make sure that the owner now actually gets what she would have gotten before. So that's, I mean, that suggests that you can actually implement this because of the government's coercive capacity, or willingness or ability to avoid a constraint like a limited liability. So
But what are they taxing if it blows
What?
up? What are they taxing if it blows up?
What is?
What are they taxing? What's left to tax if the machine blows up?
Oh, it's just, you do this for a very large number of people. It's an expectation.
Yeah, but then that raises the question.
Oh, you mean if the machine blows up, you take their house?
Yeah, but then the lender could take their house as collateral, no?
No.
Why?
Well, it depends. I'm assuming the person has wealth that the government can tax, which cannot be used as collateral. Like, for example, your labor income.
In future
Yeah,
periods
yeah.
or something.
So, I mean, you know, obviously in a non-slave society. So. All right, the problem here is, the reason why we have this difficulty is we have market incompleteness and we don't have zero transactions costs. So neither the fundamental theorem nor the Coase theorem will do the job. And therefore, just repeating what we said, the Nash equilibrium subject to a zero profit condition is Pareto inefficient. And in fact, any solution to this problem will be Pareto inefficient, modulo what Joe said about nonlinear equity contracts. Yes.
I'm going to go back to the start question here. So what if, you said you're assuming that the person has some kind of property that the government can lay claim on. What if the person doesn't have one, but then the government taxes them like future kind of, you know, whatever you make in the future, we're going to take it from you. Is that also possible?
Yeah, sure they can do that. But I mean, one of the unpleasant secrets about mechanism design is that mechanism design works relatively poorly in a liberal society. In a society in which states have in which the planner has very powerful abilities to impose heavy costs on people, like putting them in prison, whipping them, and so on. In that society, mechanism design has a huge scope. In fact, a lot of the problems and limitations of mechanism design go away if you just assume that you don't have these liberal constraints on how much you can punish people and how much you can hurt them and so on. I mean, there's something ironic about that, because remember, mechanism design is supposed to be the thing in a liberal society which gives the invisible hand a helping hand so that we can have these decentralized allocations. But it would work a lot better if we just didn't worry with all these liberal problems like not needing people and so on. Because, I mean, you know, a lot of these problems can be solved just by cranking up the punishment that happens. But of course, if a person is unwealthy, you can't take much from them. And if you can't meet them, well, I mean, yeah.
Surely in that case, the borrower is going to be I mean, we've been assuming he's risk neutral, but I'm going to become very risk averse if the government can start doing that kind of thing to me. Does that change anything?
Who did the government do bad to?
Well, if my machine fails and I still have to pay this government tax.
Yeah, but in expectations, you doubled your expected income.
But if I'm sufficiently risk averse, because I really don't like the government taking away my house or whatever it's able to do that the moneylender wasn't able to do.
Yeah, that's true. That is, the downside is greater. And I'm glad you brought up risk aversion, because I think the problem with the Robin Hood, you know, I use Robin Hood to get back to Robinson Crusoe, and there's a real problem with the Robin Hood solution, which is risk aversion, and I'll get to that in the next slide. Now, let's think about the kinds of policy conclusions. What I've said so far is the stuff in blue, but I admit that it's vulnerable to the kind of discussion that we've had. Now, if that example I just gave seemed like magic, I don't think it's magic. I think it actually conveys a real aspect of the problem. But if there is something wrong with this rabbit out of the hat, this Pareto improving redistribution, it has to do exactly with risk aversion. And I'll come to that. Now, I want to mention the De Soto plan, with which I'm sure some of you are familiar, which has to do with titling the non-titled existing wealth of the poor so that it can be used as collateral. I want to talk about, well, what would happen if we redistributed wealth to workers so that we could have producer co-ops. And when we get through this, particularly this point here about producer co-ops, we're going to find the return of the efficiency equality trade-off. It has a rather different appearance. Those of you who've read the book, it's like the return of Martin Gare. Hardly recognizable, but it is definitely the same species, an efficiency equality trade-off. Let me say something about the De Soto plan. I'm not going to give you the analysis. It's actually fairly technical, but I want to say what I found out. The idea is you tithe people's informal wealth, and it will allow some of the previously excluded borrowers to borrow, and the benefit for them is unambiguous. They benefit. But when somebody who was previously just constrained, not excluded, gets more wealth, and when that wealth is used as equity or collateral in this project, there's a very surprising result, which is the expected repayment of the loan doesn't change. And therefore, it's just a transfer of the newly titled wealth from the borrower to the lender. So the DeSoto plan under monopolistic credit market conditions is simply a transfer. It allows the wealth, which is said to be titled in the interest of the poor, to be transferred to the monopolistic lender. Now, the intuition behind this rather, this is the DeSoto effect with a vengeance, is, as I said, there is no difference in the expected repayment. How is that possible? Well, as the individual gets richer, more wealthy, their best response function is better, and the interest rate goes up. Remember, facing a monopolistic lender, the wealthier guy is paying a higher interest rate. So if the guy now has more wealth, he's going to pay even higher interest rate. What happens is the amount of the loan that you take out has been reduced, and the interest rate has been increased. And in this model, the two exactly counteract each other, so the amount of repayment isn't changing.
In your model, you have the zero profit condition, right?
Not in if you have a monopolistic lender,
right.
It's irrelevant.
But if you have competition on the lending side,
if you have competition on the lending side, then the DeSoto plan works. I mean,
yeah.
Basically, the bottom line here is that if you want to evaluate a policy intervention of this type, like titling the poor, you have to think about what is the market structure in which it's working. If it's monopolistic, it's simply the opposite of what DeSoto planned for those who would have been included already. Now, so what's the solution? Well, suppose you're excluded, and DeSoto comes along and your shanty house is now titled. You should use that titled property enough so that you're included. And don't invest any more than the minimal amount, so you're the marginal borrower, and then you benefit. Anything beyond that, you're giving away. So that's what you get out of this model. And that's, of course, something. But let's talk about a second case, and I will here give you the analytical framework. We're going to introduce the social planner again, and I've repeated the question just to remind you. We're trying to identify two equilibria. One is the status quo, and one is an equilibrium after a redistribution, which itself will be stationary, that is, not capable of being disrupted through private transactions. So we're asking, is there an allocation of property rights different from the current one, in which those who are supplying the hard-to-monitor stuff become the residual claimants, and if so, can you implement that through a redistribution? Now, we have to ask, is this new thing we're going to introduce, is that a stable Nash equilibrium? Because if it's not, it's irrelevant to policy. I mean, one of the problems in policy debates is people often think of implementing things which would be nice without asking the standard question of implementation theory, which is the thing you're implementing itself going to be stationary in the presence of whatever instruments you're using? Now, obviously, I'll apply this to the credit market. So here's the idea. We're going to introduce risk aversion. Just to remind you, the Arrow-Pratt measure is the ratio, it's the negative of the second derivative to the first derivative of a concave utility function. And we refer to decreasing absolute risk aversion as a situation in which as income or wealth increases, this lambda is decreasing. That's what we mean by, rich people, or a person being less risk averse if they're rich than if they're poor. Now let's study this looking at the following income generating function. This is the realized income of the individual. Z is a random variable with mean zero and unit standard deviation, and G of sigma is expected income. Now sigma is a risk level. And you're going to choose some risk level. And the risk level will have some effect on your expected income. And it will also have an effect in increasing the dispersion of your the realized incomes. This is called a linear class of disturbances. And it has a tremendous advantage, as you'll see in just a minute. Because if the uncertainty about the returns is being generated this way, we can convert a utility function into this two-parameter function in which this is the individual's utility, that's his expected income, that's the risk. And here we have, obviously, that the expected income is a good and the risk is not a good. I mean, I would have said it's bad, but it can be actually zero. So this takes us out of this world in which we have a lot of second derivatives running around to a world in which we can use a very standard kind of analysis which economists are familiar with, and I'm sure you've probably seen this before. But just to give you some intuition about from the standpoint of doing simple applied theory, if you start a problem with one of your basic terms having a second derivative in it, you know you're in trouble, because by the time you finish, you're going to have third and fourth derivatives. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean, I'm pretty good about having intuitions about second derivatives. With third derivatives, I really have a hard time. With fourth derivatives, I have a hard time getting intuitions. But there's these are the indifference curves of this two-parameter function, and they're very interpretable. So, for example, ignore this g function here for a minute. These indifference curves, this is a higher indifference curve, lower and lower. The important thing to notice about this is as we move up in this space, they get flatter. That's because richer people are less risk averse. As we move over in this space, they become steeper. That's because the more risk exposed you are, the more risk averse you are. At this point here, they're flat. If you're not exposed to any risk, a marginal increase in risk has arbitrarily small effect on your risk aversion. And this point here is called the certainty equivalent there of every point on that function. That means that point there and this point here are equally valuable. They're on the same indifference curve. But this will come in handy because this has zero risk. So we're looking at a zero risk option that has the same value as all this stuff here. So that's this will help us a lot in thinking about insurance, risk exposure problems, and so on. And if everybody here has already seen this, I apologize for wasting your time. For me, it was very eye-opening that you can take quite complicated problems just if you can buy the risk-generating function, linear disturbances. Now, let's think about wage determination. Suppose we have a worker, and there's an owner of the machine, and the person hires the worker. The owner pays supervision cost M because the worker has a conflict of interest with the owner. This is the monitoring or surveillance, and pays a wage W. This is the expected profits. The owner is going to choose sigma, the risk exposure, and the worker is not exposed to the risk because the worker gets the wage in any case. And so what the owner gets is that's the income of the project, minus the opportunity cost of capital, minus the monitoring cost, minus the wage. The owner is going to maximize this function. And suppose he's going to maximize this function, and that means choosing the point here, the maximum of the g function. That means choosing this point here. So that's how the owner is going to decide, because the owner is risk neutral. So obviously, they'll pick the top of the expected returns function. And what does that mean for the wage? To settle that, we introduce a zero profit condition, and that says simply that there is some wage such that the rate of profit is equal to the rate of return on capital. And this is the zero profit condition expressed here. That tells us that there is some wage that this worker can get in a zero profit condition that is perfectly competitive environment. And that's that number right there. The difference here is the cost other than the labor costs, including monitoring. So these are the wages that would be possible under the zero profit condition. And obviously the owner has picked the top of this function, and therefore this wage is the wage which will result. So that's the worker. Now we want to ask, that's the status quo. The guy's a worker. Suppose the worker were now to be the owner of the machine. what would he or she get? Well, let's look at that. Here's the case. We now have the owner-operator. The owner-operator is going to select a risk level. This is the level, remember, that the risk-neutral guy selected. But this is the level that the owner-operator will select because he or she is risk-averse. These are the indifference maps before, and you can see they choose this point here. So we can contrast these two cases and ask, would the person rather be a wage worker or would they rather be an owner? This is just identifying the first order condition for that point there. This just says that the marginal rate of transformation of risk into expected income is equal to the marginal rate of substitution along this indifference curve. That's what that says. Now let's compare these two cases. What we're going to ask is, can we identify a case in which an individual would rather stay a worker and not own the machine? And can we identify another case in which the situation is opposite? And the answer is we can. Let's look at this case here first. The worker, as you recall from the previous slide, gets this wage when we impose a zero profit condition. In this picture, if the worker had this indifference map, and the worker, when the worker becomes an owner, there's no supervision cost, so forget M, shifts this thing up, and finds this maximum here, and you can see the worker here is better off. The certainty equivalent of this condition here is better than the situation when the person's a worker. So this person would prefer to be the owner. But over here, you have the opposite situation in which the wage, which is given to which the worker gets, is better than the certainty equivalent of the point chosen by the person were he or she an owner. Now, look at these two maps and ask yourself, how do they differ? Well, the obvious difference is these things here are pretty flat. This individual here is not very risk averse. Remember, a risk neutral person has horizontal indifference curves in this space. So these flat indifference curves mean that this individual is not very risk averse. This one here is very risk averse, and that's why, notice this huge reduction in the risk taking by this individual, and that's why this individual would prefer to be a worker than to be an owner. Individual is now an owner. Well, this shifts upwards here because of the reduced monitoring cost. But fulfilling the first order condition there gives us a certainty equivalent which is inferior to the wage. But now suppose that instead of just saying this person's an owner, we actually have confiscated the machine from the rich guy or whoever had it before and give it to this person, so now the person's richer. Well, the person's richer now has two effects. The first is that the borrowing costs are reduced for the very reason that we showed in the previous cases about the borrowing costs of rich and poor people in a competitive credit market. So the opportunity cost of capital has just gone down because the guy is now a richer borrower. And because he's richer, his indifference curves are flatter because of diminishing risk aversion. And therefore, when there's a transfer of wealth involved, we have a situation in which the certainty equivalent here is superior to that of the worker, and therefore the individual will prefer to be an owner once the individual has acquired the wealth, so that he's had not only the advantage of not having to monitor himself, but also now has the advantage of having a lower cost of capital and a lower level of risk aversion. Now, I said that the efficiency equity trade-off was going to make a reappearance, and so here it comes. Here's the great thing about capitalism. The wealth is highly unequally distributed in most capitalist societies. And the people who own that wealth make fundamental decisions about innovation, technology, location of firms, and so on. And that's a good thing because they're risk neutral, relatively risk neutral. And the dynamism of capitalism is associated in some part with the fact that the decision-making power is deposited in the hands of a very small class of very rich people. Now, some of you may not think that's really such a great thing, but I ask you to think about it carefully. This is a great thing about capitalism because it achieves a more nearly risk-neutral decision-making process for society as a whole in making decisions in which the decisions ought to be made relatively risk-neutrally, because you have a very large number of people making these decisions. So this is the problem we now face. So let's think about this. Can we have capitalist dynamics and socialist solidarity all in the same society? The solidarity associated with redistribution of wealth, relatively equal wealth distribution. And can we get that without giving up the dynamics of a capitalist society, which, as I say, is fostered by and helped by, in this particular sense, the fact that the decision makers are so rich they don't care that much about risk? Well, let's see, what kind of arguments would we put forward? Well, the obvious problem is this. If you redistribute wealth to people who are poor, and therefore, if they have wealth, therefore they have decision-making power, they have control rights over these assets, you're distributing wealth and decision-making power to people who are risk-averse. And so you're going to reduce the level of innovation or risk-taking in this society. So I think that's true. But let's think about some of the others. Redistributing wealth also attenuates credit market exclusion and quantitative constraints in credit markets, which means that many more people can be engaged in innovation because they can actually borrow the money. So that's on the opposite side. It says actually the redistribution could encourage more innovation and more dynamism, just simply because of having a larger fraction of the population able to fund projects. You may wonder what fraction of the population could fund a project. Let's take a project, a really teeny project. Suppose you wanted to borrow enough money that you could buy the tools with which you worked. How much money would you have to borrow in America? About $200,000. Okay, end of story, right? What fraction of the American public could borrow $200,000? I mean, at any interest rate, but even at a reasonable interest rate. Want to guess? I mean, I don't know. But, that's a large number. The numbers you have for the fraction that are credit constrained are something like usually 2/3 or half or something like that. But that means credit constrained, you can't buy a car. Not credit constrained, you can't buy the tools with which a modern worker works. So obviously, getting more people into the game can't be a bad thing. Secondly, it's possible to design incentive-compatible insurance, which is basically redistribution from the lucky to the unlucky. When I say incentive-compatible, I simply mean you don't want to insure people against their own actions, but you certainly can insure people against many of the things which happen, which make it impossible, for example, for workers to own their own firms. Here's an example. Suppose suppose we're a widget-making firm, we, of course, are terrified about big price shifts in our inputs or outputs, and those are determined on world markets. Well, you could easily design an insurance policy which essentially we pay in if we have favorable price movements, and we get compensated if we get unfavorable price movements. You can do the same with housing, all kinds of other things. The key idea is the thing which keys the payment is nothing which we determine, it's something that is determined outside of us. Now, we do this for all kinds of things. I mean, the more elaborate ones have to do with the stochastic nature of weather and farm production. We don't do it very intelligently in the case of farm production. But you could do things like this. Have an insurance policy in which my crop is not insured. I get an insurance payment if all the surrounding crops are destroyed by drought. If mine happens not to be destroyed by drought, I get the payment anyway. And likewise, if I'm the only one whose crop was destroyed by drought, and everybody else around me is doing great, I don't get any payment. And that's just an example of an incentive-compatible insurance program, which is clearly payable by a public signal, namely, say, the rainfall in the surrounding area or the yield in the surrounding area. And by the way, the Mughal Empire in India, in one of its periods, I think it was under Aurangzeb, actually had tax obligations which were based not on what you produced, but on what everybody else around you produced. It's really, really amazing. I mean, talk about mechanism design. That's a very sophisticated kind of incentive-compatible tax system. Now, it's also true that political and economic egalitarianism can foster a more creative and innovative culture. Now, I mean this. You may say, well, that's kind of pie in the sky. No, it is not. ask, for example, if you have kids who are being trained to work in factories or firms or offices in which their main existence in their life is taking orders from somebody to do something at their command, never making decisions about big questions about what the firm should do and invest in and so on. We don't really need them to be very good at deliberating, thinking, doing cognitive work. We need them to be very good at behaving well. And if you think I'm making this up, I did a study many years ago about the correlation between personality constraints and grades in school. And the things which get you high grades in school, conditional on your actual mathematical aptitude or scholastic aptitude in English, are such things as obedience, conformity, and punctuality. And you get negatively penalized by personality traits like creativity and independence. So I'm not making this up. A society which is organized hierarchically is a very poor place to try to encourage creativity and deliberation.
Sam, I just can't resist.
What?
I can't resist the interjection here because this insurance that you talk about,
yeah.
It's come under a lot of attack. It's been attractive. Rainfall insurance has been attractive primarily because people have been worried about incentives. But actual rainfall insurance schemes that have been implemented have left people extremely unhappy because they just pay out with these tail events. And so you've had medium-sized droughts year after year. That's been one problem. And so people have felt they've been sort of cheated by this rainfall insurance in places where it's been implemented. In India, there are two sides of it. But
do you think that that's an argument against the idea or that
yeah,
an argument against the design?
Well, I think there's both. I mean, one of the problems is that insurance companies have been selling this insurance. And so even though they say it's actuarial costs, those costs are really quite high. And so break even can be quite costly actually for the farmer. But what lots of people have found is that over the years they just haven't, the net value to the farmer has been very little or negative. So lots of people who were part of non-government organizations and took it because the non-government organization came on board, like Seva in Gujarat, have actually been very unhappy with it and have discontinued after a year. So sometimes these ideas are really attractive to economists because we're so worried about the incentive problems, but they haven't actually worked that well in practice.
It sounds to me like a design problem, not a fundamental problem with the idea. And I haven't heard what's wrong with the idea. I've heard that what it sounds like is this thing is being implemented poorly, but I don't know anything about it. So that's it. This is Alexis de Tocqueville didn't think there was an efficiency equity trade-off, and neither did Franklin Roosevelt. Let's see, do I have anybody else here? All right. Well, and that this is to admit that there was something a little hokey about my example. Those are some of the readings that I refer you to, including Carla's paper that I mentioned, my work with Arjun and others. Thanks very much. We have some, yeah.
Sorry, can you go back to the last slide with the couple of pros and cons? I just wanted to challenge you. Yeah, the actual one, just go right.
This one here.
Yeah, because so I think that the couple of issues are a little bit confounded here because just because you have an egalitarian economy doesn't necessarily mean you have an egalitarian education system or an education system that fosters creativity. And I like to think about the context of Austria, where I come from, versus the United States. And to me, the United States is one of the most innovative society, and also a society that it has the highest inequalities, yet in terms of like where you can go with your ideas, I think it's one of the most liberal societies in the world. Contrasted with Austria, with very, comparatively very little inequality, and a very, an education system where the public sector is still predominant, yet innovation is, I mean, why would you innovate and have, that's sort of like, why would you have innovative ideas? Like, at any time you try to change a system at any level, I feel like people don't like to innovate. So I just wanted to challenge that sort of notion.
I'm happy with the challenge. I don't think comparing two countries informally the way you did is the way to do it. And I provided some actually very hard evidence for what's being rewarded in American schools. Maybe that's also being rewarded in Austrian schools. But Suresh, did you have a comment on that?
Well, just two things. One, I mean, the first thing is also, you know, the traits that are getting rewarded that in, you know, in your original work that, you know, there were these conscientious things, but more recently all of this stuff is suggesting that it's like impulse control, and that this, you know, this ability to, that the Heckman sort of stuff on just like your ability to restrain like short-term responses, and that in fact is the underlying variable that schools are kind of fixing, and you know that might be associated with the creativity. And the second side of this, as another retort to this, is Hayek basically saying that actually the important thing for culture in its best form is an elite, and an elite that's freed from the constraints from having to deal with decisions about production, this boring stuff, that you need actually somebody who was born to wealth, could stay and who could cultivate like a sensibility and exercise judgment and aesthetic judgment, which, you know, if your mind is occupied with these boring details of production, you can't actually cultivate aesthetic taste. And so that actually that, you know, a lot of the art, and particularly the patronage of the arts that capitalists exercise, is actually really important for creativity.
Can I quote you on that?
Yeah. Well, you can quote Hayek, you can quote Hayek on that. You can quote.
No. I think all human beings are capable of the kind of thing Suresh is talking about. And I think a society that preserves to only 5% those privileges can't possibly be in getting the best out of us. Because I know a lot of those 5% because of where I happened to have gone to school. And I can tell you that they're not all very creative. I think taking a chance on the other 95% probably would be a good bet. But I think the idea somehow that, you know, it may be that in the past, when in fact people had to work full-time most of their life, that it was, you know, there was that argument about a cultivated class and so on. But Suresh and I were talking last night of what fraction of your waking hours in your lifetime do you think you're going to spend working? 5%?
100%. I'd round up.
100%? Well, you work 100%, you know. No, I mean seriously. How many? What fraction of your hours awake in your life, from the time you know, from the time you're say 15 or 18 until the time you die, do you think you're going to be at a place called work? If you're a normal person who has a job as say a dentist or a secretary or something. I mean, I didn't do the numbers, but I started to do the numbers, and it just doesn't count. It's just not there. You're scowling, Joe. No, write it down. I mean, you know, the first time you have a long period of education. Then even when you're working 1,750 hours a week, a year. That's all. And then you stop at age 55 or 60, and you live for 30 more years. I mean, you know, add it up. We don't spend much time working, and we don't have to. And there's no reason not to equip everybody with the means to become as creative as a few of those people will become. Arjun.
This may be sort of naive question, but I was just thinking about the idea of a Pareto improving redistribution. And moving from an autarky to free trade also a Pareto improving redistribution? We just don't call it that, because there is redistribution between people who used to have a particular set of assets before and a particular set of income before and after. And if that is right, is it just the framing, the political framing, which says that this is impossible, that is to be decided?
The argument is not that moving from autarky to free trade is a Pareto improvement. It is that because it increases the surplus, it allows a Pareto improvement if the redistribution is actually done. Now, if you can actually do the redistribution without undermining whatever it is that that supports the surplus, then you're right. And the problem in redistributing wealth is to figure out a way that you can actually redistribute wealth and then compensate the losers without canceling the advantage that you got by the initial redistribution. And that's why the difference between the limited liability and the coercive power of the state to extract the payment was crucial for that example. It's a lot easier in the case of free trade and autarky. I mean, I don't say it happens, but from this mechanism design problem, it's pretty easy to see how you do that. The problem if you're redistributing and having a Pareto improvement is harder. And the reason why it's harder is you start off, you know, obviously taking things away from people, and you've got to give it back to them without canceling the advantage you had of actually giving it to the poor person in the first place. Suresh.
So, I guess sort of the one thing I'm thinking is like none of the models you presented, and I know lots of your models, so, but they never have like ultimately the thing that a lot of people put in the models to justify inequality, which is heterogeneity in abilities, right? And that, in fact, it's, you know, that, and so it's like, when there is so do we think that that's not true, that there isn't heterogeneity in ability, or do we think that even with models where, say, the landlord actually has some sort of comparative advantage in production and can do more per unit hour, so I'm curious, in a world with where there is productive heterogeneity, do we still think this class of Pareto improving redistributions exists?
Yeah, I think in fact that I think what I'm doing is immune from that criticism, but it says there's a whole class of problems which I haven't said anything about. Because this is a world in which everybody is identical. There are no differences. And what that says is if you have differences in income or standards of living between people who are identical with respect to all of those things, then you can do these things and it'll be Pareto improvement. Now, unless you think that the only differences we have in society in our living standards are because of heterogeneity among agents, which are the reason for those differences in income, and no labor economist would sign up for that idea.
Lots of Chicago people sign up for
well,
that idea.
there's no support for that in the data. I mean, if that were true, then you should be able, in a Mincer equation, to explain virtually all the variance of income. And as everybody knows, you can't get much above 0.3 or 0.4 in an R-square. So it means there's just a whole lot of variance among people who are statistically very similar. You know, white male, 35 years old, you know, who are, you know, steel workers. Yeah.
So I had a comment on your observation a few slides earlier that it is desirable for society to make risk-taking decisions in a risk-neutral manner.
Yeah.
So I think you're right when it comes to idiosyncratic risk, but when it comes to aggregate systemic risk, I'm more skeptical about it.
Yeah, you're right.
So for example, for internet entrepreneurs, it's great if you take the maximum risk possible. But for example, for the people who rule our financial system, when they all take the same aggregate risk and it shuts down our economy, it's extremely undecided.
Yeah, actually, this lecture probably would have gone down a little better if the world since 2008 hadn't happened. Because essentially what I'm saying is we should find a way of getting more people to borrow money. And we should make sure that we don't worry about risk too much. But I think the argument's well, you're certainly right about the Joe.
Yeah, there are a couple comments. One is, I think, in a way, this goes back to your last slide. The one view in the Scandinavian countries is that they have social insurance programs that encourage risk-taking. That they may not be perfectly incentive compatible in either language, but they do the risk mitigation is offsets the incentive effects sufficient that they actually do promote more innovation.
Can I comment on that? Because I think that's really right. Let's go back to one of these things here. Yeah, very first one. Sorry. This is the situation in which we have now. Now, suppose that what happened is we have some risk mitigation. That pushes this whole function over here to the left. And that puts everybody on the part of their indifference maps that's flatter. And so, I mean, there's I think, a very powerful interpretation of social democracy in Nordic Europe, which is that it's not redistribution from the rich to the poor. It's redistribution from the lucky to the unlucky. And that has the effect of sponsoring additional risk-taking by getting people over here in the part of the graph where their indifference curves are flat. And there's a wonderful paper by Musgrave and Domar in QJE 1945 or 1946. Have a look at it. They said exactly that. And it's, you know, this is the idea that this could explain, although I'm not sure it does explain, it could explain why you have such high levels of innovation in some Nordic countries like Finland. Musgrave and Domar. Yeah, really nice paper.
Yeah, the second observation is that go back to don't go back to any of the earlier models. Where for instance, you had different entrepreneurs with luck and where they had failures. Presumably, if you had a large number of these, you could have a contract where you bring bring them all together, have risk sharing among them, and solve the limited liability problem. Not perfectly, but almost. And in a sense, what you are doing, if you do that, is creating a government.
Yeah.
And one way of thinking about government is as a low transaction cost risk sharer and contract enforcement.
I mean, notice, the government is a low transaction cost enforcer. That's exactly what it is. But I'll give you an example. There are a bunch of fishing cooperatives in Japan. Each boat is a member of the cooperative. And there's a very large number of boats. And they land their catches at the same time every evening. There are a lot of private boats, too. And they land their fish at the same time so they can share. And they pool everything and they divide it up every evening. And somebody studied the risk-taking behavior on the part of the guys who pool and the guys who don't pool. The guys who pool take a lot more risks in terms of the kind of the places they fish and the kind of fishing technology they use. And by the way, they repair their nets actually together. So they're essentially socializing the risk and promoting risk-taking by this private organization, which is of course a private version of what Joe referred to as the Nordic, risk mitigation.
And the final observation is, particularly when you were talking about are there people who have greater ability to make decisions, that kind of heterogeneity. Two observations. One is differences in ability to make decisions do need necessarily have to be associated with control rights of some form. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't still have Pareto improving redistributions.
That's right. And I mean, suppose some people are better at, say, managing a firm than others, then obviously they should be the ones managing the firm. The question is, who is the residual claimant on the income of the firm? Is it the guy who's the manager, or is it the workers who own the firm? Now, those are two different kinds of firms. One is a classical capitalist firm, the other is a co-op. Alkin and Demsetz in a paper in 1972 in AER said that the classical capitalist firm was the right solution to the problem of shirking because the monitor, the manager, had to have the right to exclude others, that he had to punish people who were shirkers, and he wouldn't have any incentive to do that unless he was a residual claimant. And therefore, the monitor should be the capitalist, and therefore the capitalist firm is the solution to this Hobbesian problem we have of mutual shirking in the absence of a state, some kind of state. But the argument is completely false, because notice, why not have a firm in which the workers are the residual claimants? Then they all have an incentive to monitor each other. They hire the manager. They can fire the manager if she's doing a bad job. Well, why is that easier? Why is it easier to monitor the manager than it is for the manager to monitor the workers? It's simple. There's one manager. You can look at firm performance and see how you're doing. When you're monitoring workers, you've got a team problem, and you don't know why the thing wasn't done on time. So the fundamental problem is allocating decision-making and residual claimancy in such a way that you make as easy as possible the information problems associated with monitoring and discipline. And I'm not saying a worker-owned firm is a simple kind of thing to organize, but what most economists think, which is that's an obvious way to solve the problem of shirking, it's far from obvious, because it seems to me it's far better to let the workers have an incentive to essentially inform on each other, and then they can monitor the manager and exclude her if that's the problem. Of course, the manager has to have the right to exclude the workers too, otherwise there would be a discipline problem.
Yeah, and the final observation is in terms of wealth in most advanced capitalist economies, there's a lot of inheritance. And so the assumption of the controllers of wealth having a high ability to be good decision makers is related to two properties. One is the extent to which wealth at any moment of time is a result of luck versus skill. And the second is the extent to which whatever that component of skill is inheritable.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's any strong presumption that there's enough inheritability of enough of the attribution of success to justify much inequality of wealth.
Yeah, this may have to be the last question, but suppose we have two kinds of wealth. We have this decision-making ability, some kind of human capital thing, and we have wealth, standard wealth. Well, we know that the standard wealth is transmitted across time quite reliably. That is, we can estimate what, suppose you estimate OLS, the log of the son's wealth as a function of the log of the dad's wealth. You get coefficients about 0.5 or 0.6, fairly substantial. And so wealth is inherited. It's almost certain that the ability to make decisions is less inherited than that. Now, suppose, worst case for my argument, suppose it's entirely genetically inherited. Then it's very unlikely to have anything like a 0.5 or 0.6. Things that are genetically inherited are not very similar between parents and kids. This may sound strange to you, but this is true. And the reason for that is the following. First, the two parents, the mom and the dad, are probably genetically unrelated. I mean in a correlation sense. I'm not talking about their sisters. So the correlation at any locus between parents is essentially zero. And secondly, the genes which you inherit from your parents are expressed with a great deal of noise in your actual phenotype. So, and again, this is something on which I've written more than one paper. It turns out that genetic inheritance is a very poor way of getting something from parents to kids. And so that even if the ability to run a firm was purely genetically inherited, it would surely be much less than the inheritability of wealth. And so Joe's point leads us to the following conclusion. We're going to accumulate a whole lot of people who have plenty of wealth and not a lot of ability. Why don't we stop there?
Let's start at 11 sharp.